For 90 years, ships came to an island and carried the island away. Not cargo from the island, not crops, not fish, not anything made there. The island. The actual ground dug out by hand and lifted over the water by the ton, until 4/5 of a country was gone. Where do you think it went? It went into paddocks. It was ground into powder and spread on tired soil in 2 other countries, and it became grass, and the grass became milk. It is in the bones of people who have never heard of the place it came from. And the stuff itself is the part that sounds invented. The island is a plateau of rock made, as far as anyone can tell, out of what seabirds left behind over an immense stretch of time. Droppings turned to stone tens of meters deep, right across the country. The island is called Nauru, 8 square miles, alone in the middle of the Pacific. This is not a legend. It is in the shipping records and in a case at the highest court in the world. For a few years in the 1970s, once they owned the mine and sold at the world price, those people had one of the highest incomes on Earth. No tax, free hospitals, a tower in Melbourne, an airline. By the end of tonight, the money will be gone. The aeroplane will have been taken back on a runway in another country. And most of the island will be bare stone spikes that nothing will grow in. They were never earning anything, the Hype, under any flag, at any price. There was a country, and it was being turned into money, and the money was only the sound it made while it was leaving. If these long, quiet histories get you to sleep, subscribe, and they will find other people lying awake. Tonight we follow one lump of grey rock from a doorstop in a Sydney office to the floor of the deep ocean. Now put the light out. We begin with the door it was holding open. Most valuable things are invisible until somebody needs them. There is an office in Sydney at the very end of the 1800s. It belongs to a trading company that works the islands of the Pacific, buying copra and shell and whatever else can be got into a hole. It is a plain room, with a wooden floor and a door that will not stay open in the harbour wind. So somebody has wedged the door with a lump of rock. It is about the size of a man's head, pale grey, heavy, a little chalky to the touch. It has been sitting there for years, and everybody in the building has stepped over it, and nobody in the building has thought about it once. The rock had been brought back from a small island a long way north by a man in the company's employ who thought it was an odd piece of petrified wood. That is what it looked like. That is what he told them it was. Somebody chipped bits off it to make marbles for a child, and the rest of it held the door. Now, one afternoon, a young man in that office picks it up. His job, most days, is dull. The company has a small trade in a certain kind of stone from other islands, and part of his work is testing samples of it to see how good they are. He has handled a great deal of that stone. He knows the weight of it in the hand and the way it marks the fingers. And this doorstop, he thinks, does not feel like wood at all. He asks about it and is told, again, that it is wood. He asks whether he may cut a piece off anyway. Nobody minds. nobody has minded about that rock for 5 years. He cuts it, and he tests it, and the test comes back saying something that must have made him sit down. It is not wood. It is not close to wood. It is one of the purest samples of phosphate rock anybody in that trade had ever seen. Now, phosphate is one of those words that sounds like it belongs to a laboratory, so here is what it actually is. Every green thing that grows needs it. It is one of the few things a plant cannot make for itself and cannot do without. A field that has been farmed for a long time runs out of it, and when a field runs out of it, the crop comes up thin and yellow no matter how much rain falls. You can put it back. You put it back by grinding up rock that happens to be full of it and spreading the dust. That is all fertilizer is at bottom. Ground up stone, thrown on tired ground so that the ground can go on feeding people. At the end of the 1800s, this was becoming the most urgent question in farming. Europe and America had been ploughing the same fields for centuries, and the fields were tiring. Australia and New Zealand had soil that had never been young, worn flat by weather over an immense span of time, and poor in exactly this one thing. The world was looking for that rock everywhere, and it is not common. Which is why a lump of it holding a door open in Sydney was, in the plainest sense, a fortune sitting on a floorboard. The young man went looking for the island it had come from. It is worth stopping to picture the place he found, because almost nobody has, and because everything that follows is a consequence of its shape. It is small. That word does not do enough work, so here are the numbers. The whole country is about 21 square kilometres, which is 8 square miles, which is smaller than a good many airports. You can drive around the outside of it in about half an hour without hurrying, and people do. It sits alone in the middle of the ocean, near the equator, hundreds of miles from anywhere. There is no other land in sight from any point on it. It is the top of a mountain that rises from very deep water, and almost the whole of that mountain is under the sea. The shape is simple, and it matters. There is a ring of beech and coconut palms around the edge, a narrow flat strip where a road can go and where people can live. There is a small lagoon inland. And then the ground climbs, and in the middle, filling most of the island, there is a raised plateau of grey rock. That plateau is the phosphate. Not a seam of it, not a deposit under it. The plateau is made of the stuff, tens of meters deep from one side to the other. How it got there is a question people still argue about. And the honest answer is that nobody can be certain. The version usually told is birds.
For an immense length of time, seabirds nested on that rock in enormous numbers, because it was the only dry land for hundreds of miles in any direction.
What birds leave behind is rich in exactly the thing plants need. Over a very long time it built up, and rain worked it down into the coral limestone underneath, and the limestone held it. Others think the sea did most of the work, lifting phosphate out of deep water when the island rose and fell. Most people who study it now think it was some of both, Either way, the story people tell is the first one, and it is close enough to true to be worth telling. An island made of birds. A country whose ground is the leavings of something that flew over it and did not stay. Here is the part that ought to slow you down. The people who lived there knew all about that rock. They had lived on it for something like 3,000 years, which is more than 30 times as long as the mine would last. They walked on it. They knew where the pinnacles of it stood up through the soil like grey teeth, because those pinnacles were landmarks and boundary markers between one family's land and the next. They had no use for it whatsoever. You cannot eat it, you cannot build with it, not easily. It will not hold water, and it will not take a garden well. It was the most ordinary thing on the island. It was the floor. And that is the first turn in this story, and the whole rest of the night is contained in it. That rock was worthless to them for exactly the reason it was priceless to everybody else. There was so much of it that it was not a thing at all. It was simply where you stood. The moment a chemist in Sydney wrote down what was in that doorstop, the island stopped being a place in the eyes of everyone who mattered and became a quantity. So many tons, so many years of shipping, so many acres of somebody else's wheat. Nobody on the island was told. There was no reason to tell them. The news travelled to a company office, and from there to a government, and from there to another government, and it went round the world and came back with ships. Because a thing worth having is only half the problem.
The other half is a question that had to be answered before a single ton of that plateau could be loaded. And the answer to it is where all the trouble in this story actually begins.
The island had owners. It had thousands of them, every one with a name and a boundary and a claim they could recite by heart. So how do you buy a country from people who have not agreed to sell it? A country can be owned very carefully and taken very easily. The island in the middle of the ocean was not empty, and it was not vague. It was one of the most precisely owned places in the Pacific, and the precision was held entirely in people's heads. Land is not held by the island, or by a chief, or by a village. It was held by families in small named pieces, some of them only a few paces across. A single person might own a dozen scattered plots, none of them touching, each with its own name and its own story about how it came into the family. The plots passed down mainly through the mother. A child learned the list the way children elsewhere learn a prayer. This piece by the shore, this piece under the ridge, this piece with the old tree on it, this one that came to us when your grandmother married. There were no maps and no deeds. There did not need to be. The boundaries were marked by things everybody could see, and one of the things everybody could see was the grey rock itself, standing up through the thin soil in pinnacles, like teeth, like posts already driven. Think about that for a second. The stone that the world had just decided was worth a fortune had been serving, for centuries, as the fence. There were about 1,400 people on the island, which is fewer than the staff of one large hospital. They were divided into 12 groups that a European would call tribes, and that they thought of more as families of families. 12 is not a decoration in this story. The country's flag still carries a star with 12 points, one for each. Before any of this, the island had already had 60 years of visitors, and it is worth knowing what kind whaling ships in that ocean needed water, coconuts and fresh meat, and this island had all three, and a reception friendly enough to come back for. So it became a stop. Some men stayed, deserters, escaped convicts, and sailors who had simply had enough, a couple of dozen at a time, living under the protection of one chief or another and making themselves useful. They were the channel through which everything from outside arrived. What arrived was cloth, tobacco, spirits, and firearms. That is how a place with no metal of its own came to have enough guns to fight a 10-year war with itself. Nobody set out to do that. Each single trade was small, and each one made sense to both sides on the day. They had come through something terrible in the years just before. Traders had been calling for decades, and the traders sold two things that reliably wreck a small society. They sold guns and they sold alcohol. A quarrel at a feast turned into a killing, and the killing turned into a war between the districts, and the war did not stop for 10 years. On an island 8 miles around, with firearms, there is nowhere to be that is not the war. By the time it ended, roughly 500 people were dead, which is more than a third of everyone alive on the island. It ended because Germany annexed the island in the late 1880s, sent a warship, took every gun on the island, and declared the fighting over, which it was. So this is the state of the island when the news about the Doorstop arrives. A small people, lately cut by a third, a flag from the far side of the world, put up without asking. And under all of it, land cut into thousands of small named plots, held in living memory. And the island already had a name given to it by a passing stranger. A British whaling captain had sailed by nearly 100 years earlier, looked at the green ring and the palms, and written Pleasant Island in his log. The people living there called it something else and always had, and still do. Now, the company in Sydney wanted the rock to get it. Somebody had to sell it. So who did they buy it from? Not from the 1400 owner. The deal was made between a British company and a German company, under a German flag, in offices thousands of miles from the island, and it concerned ground that neither of them had ever stood on. The German protectorate had handed its trading rights in that part of the ocean to a firm out of Hamburg. That firm held the paper. So the British company went to the German firm, and they came to an arrangement, and the arrangement was mostly about shares and about a payment on every ton lifted. The islanders were not in the room. There was no room they could have been in. What the islanders got was worked out afterwards as a detail. Each landowner whose ground was dug would be paid a royalty on the rock taken out of it. The figure usually quoted for those first years is a halfpenny a ton. Hold that against the other number, That rock was going into a world market that would pay somewhere near £1 a tonne, and later far more, which is roughly 500 times the royalty. So the owner of the ground kept about 1 part in 500 of what the ground was worth on the day it sailed. There was also a payment into a fund for the community, and there were wages for the few islanders who took work with the company, and there were goods, and there was a school. It was not nothing. It was very close to nothing. The first shipment went out in the middle of the first decade of the new century, and then it simply did not stop for the better part of 100 years. Here is how the mining was done, because the method is the reason this story has no way back. A crew would come to a plot, cut down whatever was growing on it, and scrape off the topsoil. Underneath, the phosphate lay in pockets between limestone pinnacles, some of them the height of a room, some of them the height of a house. Men went down between the pinnacles with picks and baskets and took the rock out from around them by hand. Then they moved to the next pocket and the next, working the whole plot out. What is left behind when they finish is the part nobody imagines when they hear the word mine. There is no pit, no crater. There is a field of bare white and grey limestone spikes standing shoulder to shoulder, with holes between them going down 5 meters, 10 meters, 15. You cannot walk across it without care. You cannot build on it. You cannot plant anything in it, because the thing that plants need has just been shipped to another country. A worked out plot is not damaged land, it is the absence of land, with the fence posts left standing. And it was returned to its owner in that condition, along with the halfpenny a tonne. Nauruans mostly did not do this work. The company brought the labour in, thousands of men across the decades. Most came from China, some from other islands, on contracts that took years of their lives in conditions that were hard even for that time. They lived in company lines apart, and their names are not in most versions of this story either. Now here is the turn, and it is not the one people expect. That land system was a wonder. It was fair, it was detailed, it was remembered perfectly across generations without a single written record. It gave women a central place in ownership at a time when most of the world was busy denying it. By any reasonable measure, it was better than what the visitors had at home. And it is exactly what made the island easy to take. Because when land is held in thousands of small private pieces, there is nobody who can refuse on behalf of everybody. There is no owner of the island. There is no single door to knock on, and no single door to close. A company does not have to conquer a place like that. It only has to deal with one family at a time, forever, and each family is only ever being asked about one small piece of ground. Nobody ever agreed to sell the country. Everybody separately agreed to sell a plot. That is the machine, and it was now running. It would go on running through a change of owner that nobody on the island was asked about either. Within a few years, the flag over the pier came down, and a different one went up. The men on the loading arm did not stop for it, and nor did anything else. What changed was the price, because the three countries that now owned the island between them were about to become the only three countries allowed to buy from it. There is a kind of taking that leaves perfect paperwork behind it. When the First World War began, an Australian force sailed north and took the island from Germany, and there was almost no fighting because there was almost nobody there to fight. The German administrator was removed. The pier stayed. The ships stayed. The men working the rock went on working the rock. When the war ended, the winners sat down to divide up what the losers had held, and this small green ring in the Pacific came up on the list. It was handed over as what the treaties called a mandate, which meant a country you administer on behalf of the world in trust for the good of the people living on it. The three countries that took it on were Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. And they made an agreement between themselves about how the rock would be handled, and that agreement is the quiet centre of this whole story. They set up a body with 3 members, one appointed by each government. That body bought out the private company, and from then on it owned the mine, ran the mine, and shipped the rock. Now, this looked like an improvement, and in one obvious way it was. There was no longer a private firm making a fortune out of a colony. The commissioners were not allowed to make a profit at all. That was written in. Instead, the rock was to be sold to the 3 partner governments at the cost of getting it out of the ground. Read that again slowly, because it is the trick, and it is doing all of the work. What is the market price of a thing that is never once offered on a market? The rock was not sold on a market. It was not offered to the world, or auctioned, or priced against what anybody else would pay. It went to the 3 owners at cost, and the cost was worked out by the 3 owners. So the buyer, the seller, the price setter, and the auditor were the same 3 men in the same room. There's a word for the position those 3 governments were in, and the word is trustee. A trustee looks after property for somebody who cannot look after it themselves. There is one thing a trustee is never, ever allowed to do in any legal system anywhere, and it is this. A trustee may not buy the property he is holding from himself at a price he decides. That is precisely the arrangement that ran this island for 50 years. Some of the consequences are not abstract. They are arithmetic, and they land on a family with a plot of ground. The landowner's royalty was calculated as a share of a price, but the price was a cost price, not a market price. So every time the mine got more efficient, the cost went down, and when the cost went down, the amount the islanders were paid went down with it. Getting better at the work made the owners of the ground poorer. Meanwhile, the world price for phosphate went up, sometimes steeply. None of that reached the island. The rock left at cost, and the difference between cost and what it was truly worth stayed on the far side of the ocean, spread thinly across a very large number of farms. The figures that get quoted vary, and I will give them the way the record gives them, which is loosely. Through the middle decades of the last century, the landowners received something on the order of $1 or $2 a ton. The same rock, sold openly, would have fetched several pounds, which is somewhere between 20 and 50 times as much. So, even the kindest reading of that comes out at the same place. For every £100 of value that sailed out past the reef, the island kept about enough to buy a pair of boots. And there is a second number underneath the first one, which almost never gets said. A ton of that rock spread on a paddock would go on lifting the crop on that paddock for years. So the buyer was not paying a shilling for a ton of stone. The buyer was paying a shilling for a permanent improvement to his own country, made out of a permanent subtraction from somebody else's. Some of that money did not even go to the people. A share of it was paid into funds held and invested by the administration itself, on the reasoning that the islanders could not be trusted to manage it. So a portion of the underpayment was withheld from the underpaid for their own good by the same office that had set the price. Now all of this was legal, all of it was written down, and here is the sentence that ought to sit with you. Every year, the government in charge sent a report to the world. The report set out how it was caring for the people of the island.
It was written and filed and read, while the ships went on, taking the island away.
The mandate was not a secret document. It said in plain terms that the country was being held for the benefit of its people. Nobody broke it. Nobody had to. Because the mandate said nothing at all about what should happen to the ground itself. That is the turn in this chapter, and it runs against the way we usually tell stories about empire. There was no scramble here, no massacre, no plantation, no famine, no whip. There was an agreement. It was drawn up by lawyers, passed by 3 parliaments, checked over every year, and written with the express purpose of stopping anyone from making a profit. And it moved more value off that island per person than almost any arrangement in the history of the Pacific. The absence of a private company is exactly what removed the last check. When a firm is making money, somebody eventually asks how much. There is a share price, there are accounts, there is a rival who wants in, and there is a number in the world to compare against. Take the firm away and put 3 governments in its place. Now the whole business vanishes into the internal costs of 3 treasuries, where nobody looks, because there is no profit to be angry about.
You can mark the robbed at a fair price. There was no price. There was only a cost.
Consider what the island actually had, and what a market would have made of it. This was, at the time, one of the richest deposits of its kind, known anywhere on Earth. It was easy to reach, easy to dig, close to the surface, and it sat in an ocean facing 2 farming countries that desperately needed it. If those people had been able to sell that rock to anybody who wanted it, at whatever the world would pay, the island would have been for a while one of the wealthiest places on the planet.
Saturday.
They eventually were. We will get to that, and it does not end the way you would think. For now, hold the shape of it. A country under a flag it did not choose. Its ground carried off at a price set by the people carrying it. And the shortfall recorded nowhere at all, because a shortfall against a market price cannot show up in books that never mention a market. And the rock kept going out, ship after ship, year after year, through the 20s and the 30s, out past the reef, and south and west across the water. It is easy to say that and let it stay a word. Millions of tons, ships, cargo. So let us go and look at where it landed, because it did not vanish into an idea. It went into fields, and the fields belonged to families, and those families were not rich either. That grey dust from the middle of the Pacific became grass, and the grass became milk, and the milk went into a bottle on a doorstep 8,000 miles away. That is where we go next. Not to the mine, but to the paddock. What happened to that rock after it landed is the part of this story that has never once been told to the people it was taken from. Every well-fed country is standing on somewhere else. Australia and New Zealand have a problem with their ground that most people who live there have never had to think about, and it is very old. The soil is tired, and it has been tired for millions of years. Young soil is made by violence. Ice grinds up fresh rock and leaves it in sheets. Volcanoes throw new minerals over the landscape. Rivers cut into mountains and spread what they cut downstream. Europe and much of North America were scraped clean by ice quite recently, in the way geologists count recently, and got a whole new floor out of it. Australia got none of that. Most of it has sat there quietly, being rained on for an immense length of time. Rain takes things out of soil. What is left over after that much rain is a landscape that looks green after a wet season and is chemically close to empty. The thing it is emptiest of is the thing plants cannot do without and cannot make: phosphorus. The same thing that was sitting in that plateau in the middle of the Pacific, in a layer tens of meters deep, doing nothing. So what do you do if you are farming a continent that is short of the one thing a plant cannot make for itself? You buy it from somewhere that has too much. The answer to where the island went is not complicated, and it is not hidden. It went into paddocks. Here is how it was done. The rock arrived at a works on the coast, was ground to powder, and was mixed with acid. That is all. The acid makes the phosphorus in the rock available to a root, instead of locked up in stone where a plant cannot reach it. The result is a pale, gritty, faintly sour-smelling powder that a farmer spreads on a field. In New Zealand, they went further, and the way they did it is one of the strangest images in this entire story. After the Second World War, the country had a surplus of two things. It had light aircraft, and it had young men who had spent several years flying them at low level for reasons nobody wanted to think about anymore. Somebody worked out that a hill too steep for a truck is not too steep for an aeroplane. So for decades, in the hill country of New Zealand, pilots flew heavy old machines a few meters above the grass, and out of the back they dumped ground-up Pacific Island. They called it top dressing. They did it in weather that killed a great many of them. Stop and look at that for a moment, because it is not a metaphor. An island was ground into powder and rained onto the hills of another country by hand, out of the sky, for years. And it worked. That is the part that has to be said plainly, because it is the reason none of this stopped. Grass that had been thin got thick. Country that had carried a few sheep to the hectare carried several times that. Wheat that had come up short came up full. Dairy herds got bigger, and the milk in them got richer, and the butter went to Britain, and the money came back. True countries built their farming on it. Not partly, through the middle of the last century, the whole shape of farming down there assumed a supply of cheap phosphate from islands their own governments held. It was called, quite openly, the cheapest fertilizer in the world, and it was cheap for the reason already set out. The price was not a price. Over the life of the mine, something in the region of 100 million tons of rock came off that island. Put that against the size of the place, it is 8 square miles. Work it out per person, and it stops being a statistic. At the time the digging started, there were about 1,400 people living there, which is roughly 70,000 tons of country for every man, woman, and child on it. To move 100 million tons off 8 square miles, you do not take a layer off the top, you take the country. And it went cheap. In the years when a ton of it fetched several pounds on the open market, the 3 governments were passing it to their own farmers for a fraction of that. Which is the same as saying that this island quietly paid part of the fertilizer bill of 2 rich nations for 50 years. 4/5 of the land surface of a sovereign nation was dug up and shipped abroad, and what it was shipped abroad to do was make grass grow. And now follow it one step further than the field, because it does not stop at the field. The plant takes the phosphorus up, the animal eats the plant, the person drinks the milk and eats the bread and the meat. And phosphorus in a body does not float about, it goes into bone and into teeth, because bone is largely made of it. So this is literally true, and it is the reason this chapter exists. For 50 years, children in Australia and New Zealand grew bones out of a Seabed island. Not figuratively. Think of the mineral in the bottle on the doorstep, in the bread on the board, in the small hard teeth of a child in Melbourne. All of it had been a plateau in the middle of the ocean, and before that it had been birds. A country was eaten. That is the sentence. It was eaten slowly, at cost price, by people who mostly could not have found it on a map, and who were not, themselves, rich. That last part matters, and it is why this is a sadder story than a villain story. The families on those farms were not barons.
Dem state for York coisid. See yourself in the bellingans at Headwhalia. They were people on hard country, making a living out of ground that fought them. Sheep fertilizer was the difference between a farm that worked and a farm that failed.
True, no, though. I mean, they were not asked where it came from either, and the answer was never printed on the bag. Here is the reversal, and it is the exact center of the whole night. Fertility is not created by this arrangement. It is moved. Every ton that made a hectare in Victoria deeper made a plot on that island shallower, and then absent. There is no version of this where both places end up with soil. The transaction was, from the first shipload, a transfer of the ability to grow food from one place on the planet to another. Two countries got deep ground. One country got a hole with a fence around it. And the island's share of that trade, the shilling or two a ton, the goods, the school, was not payment for a crop. A crop grows back. This was payment for the field. That is the thesis of this whole story, and every chapter from here is going to say it again in different words. So let it land now. Nobody on that island was ever earning anything. There was no income. There was a country being converted into money at a fixed rate, and the money was simply the noise the conversion made. For 30-odd years, the machine ran on quietly, and nobody involved thought of it as remarkable, because it was not remarkable. It was fertilizer. Then, in the middle of the war, the ships stopped. And the people of that island were about to learn what a place is worth, when the thing under it is, for a few years, too much trouble to dig. There were about 1,400 of them. Before the war was over, 1,200 would be put on a ship and taken 2,000 miles away, and more than 400 of them would never come back. There is a moment when a place stops being your home and becomes a position. In the last days of 1940, 2 ships came over the horizon flying the wrong flags. They looked like ordinary merchantmen, tired and rusty, of the kind that had been calling at that island for 30 years. They were German raiders, and they had been hunting in the Pacific for months. Over a few days, they sank 5 ships loaded with phosphate. Then on a morning at the very end of December, one of them stood off the reef and opened fire on the shore. They were not shelling a town. There was barely a town. They were shelling the loading gear. The island's whole working life ran through one enormous arm of steel that reached out over the water so that ships could take rock aboard without coming inside the reef. The raider shot it to pieces, along with the oil tanks and the works behind it. Then it sailed away. Nobody in Berlin cared about that island. What they cared about was the fertilizer. A great deal of what fed 2 enemy countries came off that rock, and farms which lose their fertilizer take years to notice and years to recover. It was an attack on wheat, delivered 4,000 miles from the nearest wheat field. Here is what that means for the people living there, and it is the point of this chapter. For 40 years they had been told, in effect, that they were sitting on something the world wanted. Now they found out what that actually buys you. It buys you shellfire from strangers over a machine. The war came properly in the middle of the following year. Japanese forces landed and took the island. The flag changed for the 3rd time in the lifetime of a middle-aged man, and once again, nobody living there had been asked. So what is a place worth on the day the thing underneath it cannot be shipped anywhere? What the occupiers wanted was not the rock. Nobody could ship rock through that ocean anymore. What they wanted was flat ground in the middle of the sea, because flat ground in the middle of the sea is an airfield. So the mine stopped, and the digging started again for a different reason. Men were put to work with hand tools building runways on short rations under a garrison that was itself steadily cut off from supply as the war turned. I want to introduce somebody here because from this point on this stops being a story about a substance. His name was Hama de Rojoma. He was born on the island in the early 20s. That made him one of the first people to grow up entirely inside the mining age. There had never been a year of his life when ships were not taking the middle of his country away. He was clever, he did well at the mission school, and he was sent to Australia to train as a teacher. He came home a schoolmaster. He was about 20 when the war reached him, and he taught for as long as there was a school to teach in. Then, in the middle of the war, the garrison decided the population was a problem. There were too many mouths on an island that could no longer be supplied, and there was labour needed elsewhere in the empire. So about 1,200 people out of a nation of roughly 1,700 were put onto ships and taken away. That is, more than 2/3 of everybody alive. Not 1,200 out of a city. 1,200 out of 1,700.
Take that fraction and apply it to any country you like, and you will see that this was not a deportation.
It was the removal of the nation, leaving a caretaker staff behind. They were taken about 2,000 miles northwest to a scatter of islands with a great harbour that the Japanese Navy had been using as a main base. It had been bombed, and it was going to be bombed a great deal more. There they were put to work. The conditions were what conditions were in that ocean. In 1943, on the wrong side of a supply line that had been cut. There was not enough food, then there was much less food than that. Then people began to die of the ordinary diseases that arrive when there is not enough food.
Philip Roberts was among them, and one of the things he did there was keep a record.
He was a school teacher, so he counted people and he wrote names down, which is what a school teacher does. Of the roughly 1,200 who were taken, about 460 died. That is close to 2 out of every 5, which is a larger share than almost any nation on earth lost in the whole of that war. Now put those two facts side by side, because they belong together and they are almost never said in the same breath. During the same 4 years, the shipments of phosphate to Australia and New Zealand fell to nothing, and the governments there were seriously worried about their farm output. The world was worried about the rock. Nobody was counting the people except one young man with a notebook in a labour camp. Not everybody was taken. Around 500 people were left on the island, and their war was its own kind of bad. The garrison was cut off from supply, and when a garrison is cut off, the people who are not soldiers eat last. 2 things happened there that ought to be said out loud because they are usually left out. A small group of Australians who had stayed behind were executed, and a group of islanders who had leprosy and who were being kept apart at the edge of the settlement were put into a boat, and the boat was sunk. The other thing the occupation left behind is still in daily use. To build the airstrip, the ground was cleared and flattened across the narrow waist of the island, in the one place low enough and level enough to take it. That runway is the runway today. Every flight that lands on the island lands on ground levelled by forced labour in the middle of a war because there has never been anywhere else to put one. The war ended. In the first weeks of 1946, a ship went to fetch them, and 737 Nauruans came home. Think about what they came home to.
Is richest, saves no crown?
The village was wrecked. The island had been bombed by both sides for 2 years. Where the school and the houses had been, there were craters. Where the plateau had been, there was that field of grey stone spikes. Spreading a little further inland every year the mine had run. And within months, the mine was running again. The 3 commissioners were back. The arm over the water was rebuilt. The ships came in, and the rock went out on exactly the same terms as before.
At cost to the same 3 buyers for the same fractions of a penny.
These people had just lost 2 of every 5 of their number. They came home to find that the one thing about their country nobody had forgotten was the part of it that could be loaded. Here is the reversal in this chapter, and it is the sharpest one in the story. We are used to the idea that a valuable resource makes a small country important. It does. But important is not the same as safe, and it is not the same as being a subject. What that plateau did for those people, when it finally mattered most, was make them a piece of somebody else's arithmetic. The rock is why the raider shelled the shore. The rock is why the island was worth garrisoning. The flat ground the rock had left behind is why it became an airstrip. And the very fact that the people were not needed for any of that is why they could be put on a ship. Being wealthy in a thing you do not control does not make you powerful. It makes you a location. And here is what the survivors did with all of that, which is the part I did not expect when I started reading about this place. They came home to a ruined island, they buried their dead, and then they began counting. Not money, themselves. Because there was a number from before the war that everybody on that island knew by heart. And the whole future of the country was going to turn on whether they could reach it again. Most countries put a battle on the calendar. One country puts a birthday on it. On a small island in the middle of the Pacific, there is a public holiday in October called Angam Day. The word does not translate cleanly. It means something close to having come home, or having arrived, or having got there at last. What is being celebrated is not a victory or a treaty, it is a baby. To understand why a nation would build its national day around one child, you have to know a number, and the number is 1,500. What is the smallest number of people a nation can be? The people of that island had been through a very bad half-century. There was the 10-year war with imported guns, which killed something like a third of them. Then, in the years after the First World War, a ship arrived carrying influenza, and on a small island a ship carrying influenza is the end of the world in slow motion. By the early 20s, there were somewhere around 1,000 Nauruans left alive. 1,000 people of one language in one place and nowhere else on Earth.
It's the fought line. It's carved with backtack. Somebody broken the McTeckard. City knock the city clag. Click on smutty toy. And that's presently only around a very longer.
1500. Below 1500, they were told a community this isolated could not reliably hold itself together, marry outside its own close kin, and go on. 1500, which is fewer than the crowd at a small football match, was the line between being a people and not being one. So they counted, year after year, birth by birth, a whole nation watching a total, the way other countries watch a war. On a day in late October in the early 1930s, a girl was born on that island, and she was the 1500th Nauruan alive. Her name was written down, and it is still known. There was a holiday, and there has been one every year since. I find that almost unbearably moving, and I want to say why, because it is not sentiment. The other country in this story measured itself in tons. That was the unit. Tons out, pounds in, cost per ton, royalty per ton. On that island, in the same decades, the unit that mattered was people, and they were counted one at a time, and each one had a name. Then the war took 2 of every 5 of them, and the total fell back under the line, and the whole thing had to be done again. It took until the end of the 1940s. A boy was born. The count reached 1500 a second time, and the holiday was set to carry both of them. One day in the year, for 2 children, born 17 years apart, whose only achievement was to exist and be numbered. Now, hold that in mind, because it explains a decision that otherwise looks insane. By the 1960s, the arithmetic of the island had become impossible to ignore. 4 decades of digging had taken a large share of the plateau. Anyone could stand at the edge of the workings and see how much was left. Anyone could work out how long that would take at the current rate.
Present temperatures make it must be different.
The answer was a few decades.
More to the point, everyone could see what would be there afterwards, not a poorer island. A field of limestone spikes covering most of the country, with a ring of habitable ground round the edge perhaps a few 100 meters wide. Committees were formed to ask whether the land could be repaired. They looked at bringing in soil by ship, which would have meant a fleet running for decades. They looked at crushing the pinnacles and filling the holes with the rubble, which does not work because rubble is not soil. Report after report came back with the same answer. Putting that island back was not going to happen. So the government administering the place made an offer, and on its face it was generous. Australia proposed to buy an island off the coast of Queensland and build a town on it. Every Nauruan would be moved there at Australian expense and made an Australian citizen with all the rights that carried. Houses, schools, hospitals, a green place with rain and soil, and no limestone spikes anywhere on it. The place chosen was off the Queensland coast, near a working port. Green, rained on, with soil in it, the plan went into detail. Houses, a school, a hospital, a wharf, farmland. Australia would pay, and the figure discussed at the time ran to many millions of pounds, which is a very large sum to spend on 2,000 people. And on the other side of the ledger sat those reports about whether the home island could be repaired. Shipping soil in. crushing the pinnacles, terracing what was left. Every one of them came back saying the same thing in Palutta language. It would cost more than the island had ever earned, and at the end of it, the ground still would not hold water. Look at that from the outside for a second. Roughly 2,000 people living on wreckage offered a whole new country at somebody else's cost. And they said no. The sticking point was not the houses. It was one word, and the word was sovereignty. The Nauruans asked whether, on this new island, they would be a nation. Whether they would govern themselves, make their own laws, hold their own land under their own arrangements, and be a people with a place, rather than a community inside somebody else's state. The answer was no. They would be Australians on Australian land, under Australian law. So they refused. They chose the ruined island. I want to be careful not to make that sound simple, because it was not. There were people who wanted to go. It was argued about, bitterly. Some of the men arguing to stay
had seen what a country looks like when its people are loaded onto a ship. They had counted the ones who did not come back.
They were never going to agree to a plan that started with everybody getting on a boat. But the reasoning that carried it was the one you would expect from a people who hold a national holiday about a head count. They had spent 40 years watching a number, terrified it would fall to nothing. A number can be moved to Queensland. A people, they thought, could not. Here is the reversal, and it is a strange one, because for once it is not a defeat. The generosity of that offer was exactly what made it impossible to accept. A gift of an island is a gift from an owner, and to take it is to agree in the only way that counts, that the ground under you belongs to whoever paid for it. Refusing the good island is how they kept the bad one. And keeping the bad one is the only reason there is a country there at all today, with a flag and a seat at the table. They chose to be a nation on a ruin, rather than a comfortable minority on somebody else's soil. Within a few years, that decision would give them the one thing nobody had ever offered them, which was the right to set their own price. And then they would use that right to sell the rest of the ground they had just refused to leave. But before that, there is one more island in this story, and it is the reason I can prove that what happened next was not simply a failure of judgment. Because there was a second island, with the same rock, worked by the same 3 commissioners, under the same agreement, in the same ocean. Its people were never offered a choice at all. They did not get independence, they did not get a trust fund, and they never spent a shilling of anybody's money. They ended up exactly as landless as the people who did. If you want to know what caused a thing, find the case where everything else was the same. About 250 miles east of the island in this story, there is another island. It is smaller, about 6 square kilometers, a raised lump of coral sitting alone in deep water with no lagoon and no river and almost no fresh water at all. Its people called it Banaba. The charts called it Ocean Island. So what becomes of an island with all of the same rock and none of the money? It is made of the same rock, Exactly the same rock, laid down the same way, by the same birds, over the same unimaginable stretch of time. It was found in the same year by the same young man from the same Sydney office. In fact, he went there first. What happened on Banaba in the year 1900 is one of the shortest and most consequential negotiations in the history of the Pacific. The company's man arrived, understood what he was standing on, and produced a document. The agreement he came away with gave the company the right to mine the whole island for 999 years. The payment in the figure that has come down to us was £50 a year. £50 a year for 1,000 years, for everything under an entire country that is less than a London clerk earned in the same year. Set that against what came out of it, which was tens of millions of tons of the most sought-after fertilizer on Earth. The rent on that island worked out at a sum you could not have lived on in London at the time. The document was signed by one Banaban man on behalf of everybody. They had no written language and no lawyer. Nobody there had any idea what a lease was. And nobody had guessed that the grey rock under their feet was the whole reason a stranger had sailed so far to be friendly. Within a year, the island was annexed. Within 20 years, the same 3 governments that ran the first island were running this one too. Here, same 3 commissioners, same rule that the rock would be sold to themselves at cost. So now we have 2 islands. Same stone, same company, same buyers, same price, same century. And then the 2 stories separate completely, and that is what makes this useful. The war came to Banaba as well. The occupying force scattered the population across other islands. Then, at the very end, after the surrender had already happened, the garrison on Banaba killed almost every Banaban still there. The accepted figure is around 150 people. One man survived by hiding, and it is from him that we know. When the survivors were gathered up from wherever the war had put them, they were not taken home. Instead, they were taken to a green, wet, mountainous island in Fiji called Rabi. It is some 1,500 miles away, which is about the same as the distance from London to Moscow. They arrived in December, in the rain, and were put ashore with tents and about 2 months of rations. They were told the arrangement was temporary. 2 years, while their own island was made fit to live on again. That was 80 years ago. It is still temporary. Now here is the detail that I have read several times and still cannot make sit down.
Rabi was bought for them with their own money.
The purchase was made out of the royalty fund that had been accumulated on their behalf, from the rock taken out of their island and held in trust by the administration. So the sequence is this. The rock is taken. The payment for the rock is small, and most of it is not given to them but held for them, for their own good. And then that held money is spent, without their meaningful consent, to buy the island they are moved to, so that the mining of their first island can continue without them on it. They paid for their own removal in installments, out of the proceeds of the thing that removed them. And the mining did continue. It ran on Banaba for another 30-odd years after they left, until the deposit was finished at the end of the 1970s. By then, something like 4/5 of that island was the same field of limestone spikes as the other one. The Banabans did go to court. In the 1970s, they brought a case in London that ran for years and was at the time one of the longest civil trials in English legal history. They argued the simple thing: that the Crown had held their island and their money in trust, and that a trustee cannot deal with itself. They lost the main points, and the reason they lost turns on a phrase that lawyers use and that ordinary people never hear. A trust, the court explained, can be a trust in the strict sense, which is a thing a judge will enforce, with remedies and damages and orders. Or it can be a trust in what is called the higher sense. That is a duty a government owes to the world, and to its own conscience, and to nobody who can do anything about it. A trust in the higher sense cannot be enforced by any court. It has no remedy attached. It is a promise with nothing behind it except the character of the party who made it. The Banabans were told, in effect, that their island had been held in trust in the higher sense, which is to say, held in trust in the sense that costs the trustee nothing at all. There was an ex gratia payment later, a lump sum offered without admission, and the sum was small against 90 years of shipping. Today, the Banaban people mostly live on Rabi, in Fiji. Their island belongs to a different country called Kiribati. A few hundred people live on it. To go from where the Banabans are to where Banaba is, you need a passport and a boat and a good reason. Now put the two islands side by side, because this is the whole point of the chapter. The first island got everything, the second one did not. It got independence. It got ownership of its own mine. It got the world price in full for decades. It got one of the largest funds per head of population that any country has ever held. Its people stayed on their own ground, under their own flag, speaking their own language, and they were, for a while, extraordinarily rich. The second island got no independence, as a one will know. No well a price, no fund worth a name, and no return. Its people were moved to somebody else's country and stayed there. Two countries, every controllable difference you could ask for, and the ending is the same ending. In both cases, 4/5 of the land is gone. In both cases, the people cannot grow their own food on what is left. And in both cases, the wealth that was under them is now in the soil of two other nations. You will hear this story told, when it is told at all, as a story about a small country that came into a fortune and blew it. Bad decisions, silly investments, money that went to people's heads. I do not think that survives Banaba. Because the people of Banaba never had the money to blow. They never got a fortune, they never bought anything foolish. They never made a single one of the decisions the first island is mocked for. And they finished in the same condition, with the same missing ground. Which tells you that the missing ground was not caused by the spending, it was caused by the digging. The spending is a story about a few decades. The digging is the story, and it had one possible ending from the day a man in Sydney chipped a piece off a doorstop. That does not mean the money did not matter. It mattered enormously, and it is where we go next, because the first island was about to do something no colony in that ocean had ever managed. It was going to take the mine off the people running it, and pay a great deal for the privilege of owning its own hole in the ground. The hardest thing to see is a bad deal you have finally been given on fair terms. Through the 1950s and 60s, the people of that island did something that took 20 years and almost no violence. And it worked. They organized. They set up a council. They elected men to it. Those men learned the procedures of the international bodies that were supposed to be supervising the arrangement, and then they used them, patiently, for years. They went to New York. They gave evidence. They asked, over and over, in the correct language, on the correct forms, the one question nobody wanted asked. If this island is being held in trust for us, why are we being paid a fraction of what our own property sells for? The schoolteacher who had counted the dead in a labor camp was, by now, the head chief. He was the one who put the case. And the reason it eventually landed is that the world had changed around it. Empires were being wound up everywhere, and it was becoming very awkward for three respectable democracies to be found administering a place they were, quite literally, removing. The talks ran for years, and at the end of them the island got what it had asked for, in full, in writing. It became independent on the last day of January in 1968. It was at that moment the smallest republic on Earth, with something in the region of 6,000 people on it, of whom about half were Nauruan. Then, 2 years later, it bought the mine. Understand what that sentence contains. The mine was already on their land. The rock was already theirs by every ordinary understanding of the word. And to get control of it, they had to pay the three governments for the plant, the machinery, the rail, the loading arm, and the works. The price was 21 million Australian dollars. They paid it in installments, out of the proceeds of the very rock the machinery was there to dig. So a country bought back its own ground, using the money from selling its own ground, from the people who had been taking its own ground. And everyone involved considered this a fair and generous settlement, and by the standards of the day, it was. Now the numbers change, and they change violently. From that point, the island sold its phosphate on the open market at whatever the market would pay. And within a few years, the market went mad, because everything went mad in the middle of the 1970s. Oil, wheat, metals, fertilizer. Prices for phosphate rock rose several times over in the space of about 2 years. A small country with almost no people and a very large export was standing exactly where the money landed. The figures from that period are quoted differently by different people, but they all point the same way. Measured per head of population, this island was one of the wealthiest places on the face of the earth. In some years, the number given is second in the world, behind one oil state. In others, it is simply first. Put that against the ordinary life of the people it happened to. 20 years earlier, they had come home from a labour camp to bomb craters and erect school. Their grandparents had been paid a halfpenny a ton. Now the country's income, divided by everyone in it, was several times what an American family earned. There was no income tax, because there was no need for one. Healthcare was free. Schooling was free, including sending young people abroad to university. Housing was provided. Electricity and water cost next to nothing. Government work was available to anybody who wanted it, and a great many people had it. And here is the part that the mocking version of this story always leaves out, because it ruins the joke. They knew it would end. Nobody on that island thought the rock would last. They could see the workings, they had the survey figures. The surveys around independence gave the rock 20 or 30 more good years. Everybody said that number out loud. Everybody planned around it. It sat in the room at every meeting for a generation. So they built the obvious answer. A large share of the earnings was not spent at all. It was paid into long-term funds, held for the future, to be invested abroad so that when the last ship left, there would still be an income coming in from somewhere else. And it was not one fund, but several, and the design tells you exactly what they were afraid of. A share of every ton went straight to the owner of the plot it came out of. A share went to the government to run the country. And a fixed share went into long-term funds that nobody was supposed to touch, the largest of which was held for the day the digging stopped.
Right. There were funds for housing, funds held for particular districts, and funds held for landowners as a group. Money was deliberately locked away from the very people whose ground it was by their own government for the reason every government gives.
Today is loud and the future is quiet.
Look at the shape of that. It is a sovereign wealth fund, built in the 1970s by a country with fewer citizens than one large secondary school.
For comparison, Norway did not begin putting its oil money aside until the 1990s, 20 years later, with 100 times the population and a civil service to match.
That is not a foolish plan.
That is the correct plan.
It is what every serious person recommends to any country sitting on something finite. And it is what the wealthiest resource states in the world do today and are praised for. At its height, the main fund is usually said to have held over $1 billion Australian dollars, which for a population of a few thousand is an extraordinary sum, on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars for every man, woman, and child. They were not naive. They did the reading. They took the advice. Now here is the turn, and it is the quietest one in this whole story, and it is the reason I wanted to tell it. Getting the full world price did not fix the problem. It made the problem faster. Before independence, the rock left the island at cost, and the island was robbed. After independence, the rock left the island at the highest price on Earth, and the island was paid in full. And in both cases, the same thing was happening underneath. The country was going out through the reef, by the shipload, and not coming back. A fair price for a permanent loss is still a permanent loss. It just has better paperwork. Think about what that money actually was. It was not the return on a factory because a factory is still there in the morning. It was not a harvest because a field bears again next year. It was not a wage because a person can work again next week. Every dollar that came in was matched, exactly, by a hole in the middle of the island where a plot of somebody's land used to be. That is the sentence to carry through the rest of tonight. It was never income. It was the country itself, converted into money at the going rate, and the going rate had simply got better. And there is a further trap inside it, which is the one they actually fell into. If you treat that money as income, you can afford anything, forever. A government that receives an enormous sum every year, with no tax, no debt, and no crisis, will build its ordinary life at the level of that sum. Salaries, services, the number of people on the public payroll, what a normal week looks like. All of that quietly sets itself to a flow that has an end date in the survey report. The fund was meant to be the answer to that. Save the difference, live off the savings later. It was the right idea, and for about 20 years it was actually being done. So the question that runs the next hour is not the one people ask. It is not why they wasted it. It is a harder one. What do you buy when you are a few thousand people on 8 square miles, and you have more money arriving every year than there are things on your island to spend it on? Money that has nowhere to go will always find somewhere, and somewhere is rarely as good as nowhere. Here is the problem, stated as plainly as it can be stated. A very large sum of money arrives every year on an island of 8 square miles with a few thousand people on it. There is no farmland to improve because the farmland is being loaded onto ships. There is no factory to build because there is nothing to make and nobody to sell it to. There is no domestic market because the whole market is the number of people you could fit in a football ground. There is no other industry to seed because there is no water, no soil, no timber, and no space. So the money has to leave. There is nowhere on the island for it to be. That single fact drives everything that follows, and it is almost never mentioned. This was not a country deciding to gamble abroad instead of investing at home. There was no at home. A place that has sold its own ground has no ground to put anything on. So where does $1 billion go? When it cannot stay at home, it went south, and the first thing it bought is still standing. In the middle of Melbourne, there is a tall office tower, finished in the 1970s, 52 stories of dark glass, which is more floors than anything else in the city had at the time. It was owned by an island most Australians could not have placed on a map, and it was named after that island. Local people gave it a nickname that pointed, not kindly, at where the money had come from. Everybody in the building knew the joke. It is not clear that anybody in the building followed the joke all the way to its end, which is that the tower was made of somebody's country. That building was, for a while, exactly the right idea. Prime ground in a growing city, rented to solid tenants, producing an income with no shovel involved. The whole point of the plan was to swap a thing that runs out for a thing that pays every quarter forever. They bought a great deal more. Hotels in Australia, in Hawaii, in Guam, in Fiji, office property in several cities, land, a shipping line, and an airline. The airline deserves a moment because it is the clearest case of something being both a mistake and completely reasonable. A country on an island is only a country if it can be reached. Nobody else was going to run scheduled flights to a place with a few thousand people on it, so they ran their own. At the peak, there were several jets, flying routes all across the Pacific, and they were often close to empty. As a business that is indefensible, as a piece of national infrastructure, it is exactly what a government is for. And it was more than that, because for many small islands in that ocean, those were the only flights there were. A country of a few thousand people was quietly running the bus service for a large part of the Pacific. At home, the money did something quieter than the tower, and it is the part that shaped ordinary life. Almost nobody had to work for a living, in the way most of the world means it. The hard jobs on the island were done by people brought in to do them. The mine ran on labor from other Pacific islands. The hospital, the offices and the workshops were largely staffed by people from further away again, on contracts, who went home at the end of them. So the ordinary job for a Nauruan was a government job, and there were plenty of those, and a good many were not strictly necessary. That is not a moral failing, it is what any government does with money it cannot invest at home and will not simply hand out.
The visible spending was cars.
The visible spending was cars. On an island whose only road runs about 12 miles around the outside, which is about the length of an ordinary commute, a family might own several cars. When one broke down, shipping in the part could take months, so it was often easier to buy another and leave the old one where it stopped. There are photographs from those years of that ring road, with cars rusting along the edge of it, in a country you can drive all the way around in 20 minutes. Then there are the investments that everybody remembers, because they are funny. The most famous is a musical in the early 1990s. Money from that island helped put a show about Leonardo da Vinci onto a London stage. It ran a little over a month before it closed. The loss usually quoted is a couple of $1 million. That is the story that made the newspapers, and it is the story that has been attached to this country ever since. An island that got rich on bird droppings and spent it on a West End flop. I want to put that in proportion because the proportion is the whole point.
A couple of $1 million against a fund that at its height held more than $1 billion is roughly 1 part in 500. In the accounts of the collapse of that fund, the musical is a rounding error.
It is remembered because it is easy to remember, and because it lets everybody else feel clever. What actually took the money was much duller, and it is the same thing that takes money everywhere. Property was bought near the top of a market, and was worth much less a few years later, when the Australian property market fell over at the start of the 90s. Assets were borrowed against, and then borrowed against again, so that a fall in value became a demand for cash. Advisors were hired who were not always good, and were not always honest, and were not always checked. Nobody was really auditing anybody. And underneath all of it sat a problem no amount of goodwill could solve. Running a fund of that size, across several countries in property and shipping and aviation, is a specialist job that a large nation staffs with hundreds of trained people. This country had at independence a few thousand citizens in total. There were not hundreds of trained accountants and fund managers available, because there were not hundreds of people of working age to spare for it. A RLAB specialist had to be imported, and an imported specialist is a person with no stake in the outcome and no neighbours to face. So the fund went down through the 1990s, and the going down accelerated, because when income falls and habits do not, you sell an asset to cover the gap, and then you have less income again. By the early 2000s, there was almost nothing left. Creditors moved on the assets. The tower in Melbourne was sold by receivers. Here is the reversal, and it is a bleak little joke that history made without help from anybody. That building was bought to be the thing that outlasted the island. It was the future, in concrete, standing safely in another country where no ship could carry it away. It was sold out of the island's hands, while the island was still there. The country outlived its own escape plan. Now, the pull at this point is very strong, and I want to refuse it on purpose. Giving in to it is the reason this story is nearly always told badly. The temptation is to say they were foolish, to list the aeroplanes and the musical and the cars and shake your head. It makes a good 5 minutes, it flatters everyone listening, and it is not true in any way that helps. Consider the alternative, honestly. Suppose every decision had been perfect. Suppose the fund had been run with the discipline of the best sovereign fund in the world, and had compounded quietly for 30 years without a single vanity purchase. They would now have a large pile of money in foreign markets, which is a good thing to have. And 4/5 of their country would still be a field of limestone spikes. They would still not be able to grow food. The rain would still run straight through the rock. Their children would still be living on a strip of coast a few hundred meters wide, watching the sea. A fund is not a country. It is a claim on other people's countries, and it can be lost, taxed, devalued, frozen, or simply spent. The ground is the only asset that cannot be transferred to somebody else by a stroke of a pen, and the ground is the thing they sold to buy the claim. That is the whole argument of tonight, said once more. What arrived was never earnings. It was the island in another form, and the other form turned out to be the fragile one. But the money did do one thing at home, permanently, and it is the part of this story that nobody expects and nobody can undo. It did not go into the ground, it went into the people. It is still in them, and it is shortening their lives. And that is where we go next. A bill for a way of life is not always sent to the country. Sometimes it is sent to the body. Before any of this began, the people of that island fed themselves. The way they did it was clever, and it is worth setting out in full, because almost none of it is left. What did they eat before the ships came? They fished, obviously. They lived on coconut and on pandanus. Pandanus is a tough shore plant whose fruit can be dried and kept for months, and it grows on ground where almost nothing else will. And they farmed fish inland, which very few people in the world were doing. There is a small lagoon in the middle of the island, brackish and still. Nauruans would go out to the reef, catch the tiny young of a particular fish, carry them home, and put them into that lagoon and into ponds. The fish would grow in fresh water. It was a food supply that did not depend on the sea being kind on any given day. They also kept birds. Men would catch frigate birds, which are enormous sea-going birds with a wingspan wider than a man is tall, and tame them and keep them on perches, and they would return. It was partly food and partly something closer to falconry, and it was one of the things that made the island itself rather than anywhere. None of that needed money. All of it needed land and water and knowledge. Now put the mine on top of it. 4/5 of the island becomes limestone spikes, which is the same as saying that only 1 acre in 5 is still land. The lagoon and the coastal strip are what remain, and the coastal strip is where every house, every road, every shop, and every public building now has to fit. You cannot grow pandanus in a hole between 2 pillars of rock. You cannot dig a fish pond into a plateau full of caves that will not hold water. The knowledge did not disappear because people got lazy. It disappeared because the ground it applied to was on a ship. And at the same moment, the country had a great deal of money and a harbour. So the food came in, not because anybody decided to give up their own food. Because this food was there, it was cheap, it kept in a hot climate without a fridge, and nothing else was growing outside the door anymore. What came in was white rice, tinned meat, tinned fish, sugar flour, cooking oil, soft drinks, beer, and later instant noodles and frozen chicken. Almost all of the food eaten on that island today arrives by ship. Think about what that does over 40 years. These were people who had eaten fish and coconut and shore plants for 3,000 years on an island where getting anywhere meant walking. Now the food is sugar and white flour and tinned fat, and everybody can afford a car on an island where the road round the whole country takes 20 minutes to drive. The result is one of the sharpest health emergencies anywhere on the planet, and it has been for decades. The figures are hard to look at. In the surveys that get quoted, something close to 9 adults in 10 are overweight, which is about the highest proportion measured anywhere in the world. Type 2 diabetes runs at rates around 1/3 to 2/5 of the adult population, against roughly 1 in 10 across the world as a whole. Life expectancy on that island sits somewhere around 60 years. In the 2 countries whose farms its rock went into, the figure is over 80. That gap of 20 years is not an accident of climate. Researchers argue about why Pacific peoples in particular have been hit this hard, and the honest answer is that it is not settled. One old idea runs like this. People who crossed huge stretches of ocean and who lived through hunger were shaped over many generations towards bodies that store energy well. A body like that does very badly when it is handed all the sugar it can eat. The theory is argued over and has been for 50 years. What is not contested is the simpler part. If you remove a people's ability to produce food and replace it with shipped calories, and do it fast, this is what happened. It has happened in the same shape in a dozen places. I want to say plainly that I do not think there is a moral here about anybody's discipline. Nobody chose this menu. The menu is what is left when the garden is a quarry. And think where that leaves the holiday. This is a country that spent the 1920s in terror of dropping below 1,500 people. It built its national day around a head count. Now it has a health problem that no birth rate can outrun. There is one more thing the mining did, and it is only now being understood.
A stand on the worked-out plateau in the middle of the day. It is bare, pale rock from horizon to horizon, with no shade and no soil, and it throws the sun straight back up.
People who have studied the island say the heat rising off all that bare stone helps push rain clouds away from it. So a place already short of water gets less of it than it otherwise would. Water deserves its own moment here, because water is what decides whether people can stay at all. Whether or not that is the whole explanation, the shortage is real. There is no river and no lake worth the name. Drinking water comes off roofs when it rains, and out of a plant that boils the salt out of seawater and off ships. In the bad droughts of the last 30 years, the rain has stopped for long enough that the tanks ran dry. Water was rationed. Water was shipped in by tanker to an island surrounded by ocean, by a government that was struggling to pay its fuel bill. And the fuel bill is not a detail. The machine that boils the salt out of seawater runs on the power station. When the fuel ships were late, the lights went out. And when the lights went out, the taps followed a few hours later. So here is the reversal, and it is the one that will still be true in 100 years. The wealth removed the need to grow food. That was experienced at the time as freedom, and it genuinely was. Nobody has ever missed subsistence farming while they were doing it. Not having to fish in bad weather is a real improvement in a human life. But the same process that removed the need also removed the possibility. The need can come back. The possibility cannot, because the possibility was made of soil, and the soil is grass in another hemisphere. That is what an economy of this kind does when it ends. It does not hand you back the life you had before it started. It hands you the life you had during it, minus the money. By the early 2000s, that is exactly where the island stood. The rock was nearly finished. The best of the deposit was gone, and what remained was harder and dirtier and more expensive to get at. The fund was gone. The tower was sold. The ships had mostly stopped. And the population was still there. Still a nation, still with a flag and a seat at the United Nations, still holding the thing they had refused a green island in Queensland in order to keep. Which raises the question the last part of tonight is about, and it is the strangest turn in the whole story. When a country has sold everything it has, there is still one thing it has not sold. Not what it owns, what it is. A country is not only a place, it is also a set of permission. By the middle of the 1990s, the position on that island was this. The best of the rock was gone. The fund was going. The buildings abroad were being sold or seized. Income was falling every year, and the cost of running a state was not. So what does a country have left to sell once the ground is finished? The government looked at what it still had and found that there was one thing, and the thing was not physical at all.
It was a seat. It was the right to make law, to issue documents, to recognize other countries, to license, to register, to permit. Every state on earth holds those powers.
They are what a state is. Most states never think of them as goods because most states have other things to sell. This one did not, so it sold them in order from the least visible to the most. It began with banking, and the idea was simple. The country passed laws under which anyone in the world could register a bank on that island. The bank did not need an office there. It did not need staff there. It did not need to hold any money there, or to be visited, or to explain itself. It needed a fee, and the fee is usually quoted at something in the region of $25,000. At the height of it, there were said to be several hundred banks registered on an island, with one main road. Nearly all of them were a name on a sheet of paper in a filing cabinet, and nothing else. That is a product with wonderful margins and one predictable customer base. Money that wants to stop being traceable. At the end of the 1990s, the money watchdogs of several countries began pointing at that island by name. The sum quoted in those years, for money moved out of Russia through banks registered there in 1 year, ran into the tens of billions of dollars. Hold that against everything else in this story. Roughly 100 million tons of rock, dug over 90 years, was worth a few billion. A filing cabinet for a couple of years moved more than the island did. That business did not end well and did not end slowly. The country was put on an international blacklist. Then the United States, using new powers passed after the attacks of 2001, effectively cut those banks out of the dollar. A bank that cannot touch dollars is not a bank. The laws were repealed, and the industry vanished. The next thing sold was documents. For a period, the country ran a scheme under which foreign nationals could purchase citizenship and passports, and in some cases papers describing the holder as a diplomat. That also ended abruptly, and it ended when men who should not have been holding such documents were found holding them. Once that happens, the product is dead, because the entire value of a passport is that other countries trust it. Then came the strangest item on the list, and it is one that only very small countries can sell. Recognition. There are places in the world whose existence as countries is disputed, and what they want more than anything is other governments willing to say that they exist. A vote at the United Nations is a vote whether the country casting it has 10,000 people or 100 million. so that islands recognition became something that could be given and withdrawn and given again. It has moved between two rival capitals in Asia more than once over the last 20-odd years, each time close to an announcement about aid. It has been extended to two disputed territories, on the far side of the world, again alongside assistance from a large state with an interest in the matter. Nobody involved describes any of this as a sale. Everybody involved understands it perfectly. And then, in 2001, the largest arrangement of all, and I am going to set it out flatly and let it stand. Australia had been dealing with people arriving by boat and asking for protection. It reached an agreement under which some of those people would instead be taken to that island and held and processed there, in a centre paid for by Australia. The arrangement ran, closed, and reopened some years later. For much of the last 2 decades, it has been the largest single source of government revenue on the island, at times a very large share of the entire national budget. It employs a substantial number of people there. It has been examined by courts, by parliaments, and by United Nations bodies, and it is defended by both governments and criticised by others. And I am not going to litigate that here. What matters for tonight is the shape of the transaction, which is the same shape as everything else in this story. A rich country needed something done. A small country had the one qualification required, which was being somewhere else. And what it sold was not a mineral or a service or a product. It sold the use of its own borders. Now, put the 4 of them in order, because the order is the point. Rock, then banking licenses, then passports, then recognition, and the use of the border itself. Every step is less physical than the one before. Every step is harder to see, easier to ship, and cheaper to produce. And each one, at the moment of sale, felt more sustainable than the rock, because a license weighs nothing, and a vote can be cast again next year. That is the illusion, and it is the reversal in this chapter. None of those things regenerate either. A banking industry is only worth having while other countries trust your regulator, and you can sell that trust exactly once. A passport is worth what other governments believe about it, and one scandal ends it. Recognition can only be sold to whoever is not currently paying you for it, which means selling it costs you, the buyer. And the use of your border is worth whatever one neighbour's politics says it is worth, on the day, with no notice. Irrelabes is the same trade as the phosphate. Take a thing you cannot make more of, convert it into a payment, and then be a country that no longer has that thing. The rock at least took 90 years to run out. And in the middle of this, one event happened that says everything, and it happened just before Christmas, in 2005. The country's airline had been in trouble for years. That December, its last remaining jet was on the ground in Melbourne, and a creditor took it. The aircraft was seized on the tarmac and did not fly home. Understand what that meant that afternoon. A sovereign nation of about 10,000 people in the middle of the Pacific hundreds of miles from anywhere, no longer had an aeroplane. There were no other airlines. For a period, apart from the occasional ship, there was no route in and no route out for anyone who lived there. A friendly government helped pay for a new one in the end. Why that government was friendly is on the public record, and it belongs on the list above. A country that once flew half the Pacific about its business could not get its own citizens to a hospital. And while all of that was going on, something else was happening, quietly all the way around the island on the narrow ring of coast that is the only land anybody can actually live on. The sea was coming up. The last great effort that Ireland made with its money was to go to court. At the end of the 1980s, with the funds still large and the rock still coming out, the government did something that small countries almost never do. It sued one of the countries that had administered it, at the highest court there is, over what had been done to the ground during the years of trusteeship. The argument was the one that had been sitting there since the beginning. You held this island in trust. You dug 4/5 of it up. You paid a price, you set yourself, and you left it in a condition in which people cannot live on it. The case was expensive, and it took years, and it never reached a full judgment on the merits. The court did rule that it had the right to hear it, which was itself a serious defeat for the other side, and shortly after that, a settlement was reached. The figure was around 107 million Australian dollars, some paid at once, and the rest over 20 years, with contributions from the two other partner governments. There was no admission that anything wrong had been done. Set that against what left the island, roughly 100 million tons of the best fertilizer rock on Earth, over 90 years, into the farms of two developed nations. The settlement works out at about $1 a ton, which is less than it cost to ship. Now that money was meant for a specific purpose, and the purpose is where this story becomes genuinely strange. It was to repair the land. To take that field of limestone spikes covering most of the country and turn it back into ground a person could stand on and build on, and perhaps one day grow something in. So how do you repair it? You cannot import soil at that scale. You cannot fill the holes with anything you do not already have. There is only one material on that island in any quantity, and it is limestone pinnacle. The answer they arrived at is to mine it again. They go back over the old workings, take out the lower grade rock that was left behind between the pillars the first time, crush the pillars down, and level what remains. The crushed stone fills the holes. It produces at the end a flat, pale, bare plateau and a small amount of export income to pay for the work. Read that again. The way to repair the damage caused by mining the island is to mine the island. The wound and the treatment are the same activity, done twice. And while that has been going on, the other clock has been running. Everything on that country is on the coastal strip. Every house, the hospital, the school, the port, the runway, the power station, the graves. It is a ring of land a few hundred meters wide. It is the only part of the island that was not dug up, for the simple reason that it is where the people were living. The sea is rising. On a low coral coast, it does not arrive as a wave. It arrives as a slow theft. The beach goes first, then the edge of the road, then the salt gets into the ground, where anything still grows. Protherston, the Nova country is now working to publicly is to move. Not off the island, up. The idea is to take the population off the ring of coast and resettle it on the plateau in the middle, which is to say, on the mined-out land. On the crushed spikes on the levelled workings, on the bare grey floor left behind when the country was carried away. The only high ground they have is the hole. That is the ring closing, and I do not think anybody planned it. The ground they sold is the ground they now have to live on, because it is the only ground that is above the water. And there is one more thing, which is why this is not a story that's finished. Out in the middle of the Pacific, on the floor of the deep ocean, several kilometers down, there are stones. They are dark, roughly the size of a potato, and they lie loose on the mud in enormous fields. They are full of the metals that go into batteries and wiring and steel. They are called nodules, and the way they form is the part that matters. They grow around a fragment, a shark's tooth, a chip of bone, by adding layers unimaginably slowly. A single one of those lumps takes something in the order of millions of years to reach the size of your fist. That is more than 10,000 times as long as the mine on that island ran. They are, in other words, exactly the same kind of thing as the phosphate. A deposit built by a slow, natural process, over a length of time no human can hold in their head. Lying in a place where nobody lives, worth a great deal of money, and gone for good the moment it is lifted. Companies want to mine them. Under the rules of the sea, a company cannot do that alone. It has to be sponsored by a country. And the country that stepped forward is that island. It pressed the body that governs the deep seabed to hurry up and write the rules, and it forced the clock to start. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the last thing I want to leave with you. They are the only people on Earth who have already run this experiment all the way to the end. They know precisely what it looks like when the deposit is finished. They're living on the answer, and they are the ones sponsoring the next one. It would be easy to be scornful about that, and it would be wrong. They are also the country with the fewest options on the planet, and the reason they have the fewest options is the last time somebody did this to them. There is a straight line from the doorstop to the seabed, and every single point on it was a reasonable decision made by somebody with no better one available. So here is the whole thing, one final time, in the plainest words I have. Nobody on that island was ever being paid. There was no income, at any stage, under any flag, at any price. There was a country, and it was converted into money, and the money was only ever the sound the country made while it was leaving. And it is not a story about a faraway place, which is the part I would like to leave under your pillow. That rock is in your food, not as a metaphor, Phosphate is not optional for growing anything. There is no substitute for it, and the world's supply of it sits in a very small number of places.
Every loaf you have ever eaten was grown with rock somebody dug out of somebody's ground. And there is no version of farming anywhere that does not do this.
It is worth knowing where it comes from now. Most of what is left in the world sits in one region of North Africa, in and around a territory whose ownership is itself disputed. A handful of other countries hold most of the remainder. There is no way to manufacture the stuff. There is no substitute for it. And the food supply of 8 billion people depends on digging it out of the ground and spreading it on fields. So what happened to that island is not a curiosity from the age of empire. It is the ordinary condition of the fertilizer trade, and it is running tonight, somewhere, in ground that belongs to somebody who is not in the room. And the accounting trick at the heart of it is not exotic either. Spend the thing and call the proceeds income. Book the sale of what you own as this year's earnings, and set your life to that number. An oil country does it. A pension does it, if you get the sums wrong. So does anybody who sells the family land and treats the check as a good year. We have watched an island be recognized, and priced, and dug, and shipped, and eaten. We have watched its people counted, deported, counted again, and offered a green island they could not accept. We have watched them buy back their own ground, become the richest people alive for a few years, and end up standing on the part nobody wanted. And it all started with a lump of grey rock in an office in Sydney, holding a door open, worth nothing at all until somebody looked at it properly. If these long, quiet histories help you get to sleep, then subscribe, and they will find their way to other people who lie awake.
Now let the island be.
And let yourself be. Somewhere south of here there is a paddock in the dark with deep grass on it, and the deep grass is made of a plateau that used to be birds, and none of it needs anything from you tonight. Sleep well, good night.